All right. So a couple of things I'd like to look at. I'll start with, I have 2 or 3 things that are kind of a little more rapid fire, and then if we have time at the end, we may talk a little bit about your personal plans that you worked on. But I want to start off just with a quick discussion of creativity. It's rather ironic that I'm just going to do this as a lecture, but it's fine. You can rewind that and you get it later. But so the idea is that creativity and intelligence are actually 2 different parts of the brain. So one is not necessarily equivalent to the other, which means that you could have really creative people who are not necessarily book smart, right? Or vice versa. People that are very book smart, kind of boring, plain, Or you can have a little bit of both. They're not mutually exclusive to the extent that if you have one, you don't have the other. They're just different, right? And so you can develop the one, and the idea is that you can actually, in some ways, develop creativity. Sometimes when we think of intelligence, we think, oh, we can work on intelligence, and I can work on my intelligence. I planted that just so that we could have something to work on. But we tend to think of being able to work on intelligence, but we tend to think of creativity as just something either you're born with or you're not. But the idea is there are some things that you can do to enhance creativity as well, right? Okay. So first we'll talk about a couple of hindrances to creativity. Boring professors. No, I'm just kidding. That's that one. Routine. I'll give you 3 big ones. Number 2, stress. And number 3, ego. Yeah, when somebody thinks that they already know everything, then they're less likely to think outside of the box, right? And so, yeah, that's a very boring way of saying it. No, I'm just kidding. Right, so ego tends to get in the way of creativity. Stress can get in the way of creativity if not managed properly. Some people use stress to fuel their creativity. Like if they're in a bind and they really need, then they think better that way. But not everybody. There are some people that stress causes them to be less creative. And I think in some ways it might depend on what kind of stress it is. If it's a deadline that you got to meet, then maybe you're a little more creative because you're trying to figure out a way to meet this deadline. But if it's that draining stress of things going on in your life and relationships that are out of whack, or kids that are going crazy, or financial stress that just drains you, it doesn't have a deadline to it, it's just there and it sucks the life out of you, I think in that kind of stress, it is a hindrance to creativity. But if it's stress like your boss says, hey, you got to figure out a way to get this done in the next 2 days, then a lot of people rally around that and they start, okay, how are we going to get it done? But I think the stress that hinders creativity, like I said, is more of a draining, nebulous. You can't really put your finger on it, but it's sucking the life out of you because it's your circumstances and how you see them. I think probably one of the most important ones is routine. That when you get stuck in a routine where you do the same things every day, that it tends to hinder your ability to think creatively. And so there's some interesting research that tends to explain why that is. That your brain has, there are parts of your brain that analyze your circumstances or your context, your environment, right? The room that you're in. And based on your brain's perception of your context, it turns on certain parts of the brain and turns off other parts. Basically, what it feels like it needs in this environment is what it pushes, right? So if you're in a routine and you're in an environment where your brain is used to doing the same thing over and over and over again, so if you're at work and you do the same thing every day, your brain will push not the creative side, but the side that is the routine side. And so you will have a hard time thinking extremely creatively if you are in an environment that your brain has associated with routine, right? And so this is why, like for myself, if I'm here, I can make a lot of notes, I can do a lot of research, but I don't necessarily brainstorm all that well in the office. And so what Melissa and I will do is probably at least once a week, I go get a large tea, highly caffeinated tea, and we go down to Celebration or somewhere, most of the time Celebration, and just walk around the town for like an hour or two. And just walk, and we just talk about what we plan, what we want to do, what's coming up. Because in a different environment, your brain is more free to think differently. And so if you have a particular environment where your brain is used to this is just routine, then it's kind of hard to think outside of the box there. So that's why sometimes, like Charles, you probably have a study room, and when you get in there, your brain often you will find daydreaming or thinking about things because you're in a different environment. It's an environment where your brain has associated when we're here, we think outside of the box a little bit, or we brainstorm a little bit, or we have deep thought. And so that's why it's good to have places where your body is used to going to research and to study, but then sometimes it's good to just get out and be in a different environment. You'd be surprised what walking down the beach will do for your creative thinking, or walking through the mountains, or wherever it is that you want to go. Just getting out, and sometimes we don't even realize what's going on at a physical level, is that your brain is now in a different environment that it doesn't have a routine associated with, and it frees it up to now then just think about whatever is there, right? Whatever happens to pop up. And so there are physical reasons why it's important to literally get away from your routines if you want to have creative thought.
Is that why people, or at least the people I do, when I go to bed at night, I'll lay down, and all of a sudden I'll just be flooded with, ideas about, oh yeah, I could do this, or oh, I can do that.
Is that right before you go to sleep?
Yeah, just like, you turn off the lights and you lay down, and you can't, shut it off.
Interestingly, in terms of sleep, I have some of this in a different lesson, but we can talk about it now since you bring it up. Your brain is 20% more active in sleep than it is when you're awake. And so, yeah. Yeah. And so the interesting thing is what they're starting to find out about sleep is that your brain actually kicks into high gear while you're sleeping. So then the question is, well, what is it doing, right? I mean, why is your brain so much more active in sleep? You would think it'd be the other way around, that everything else on you has shut down. You would think your brain, because you're not thinking at all while you're sleeping much. I mean, not cognitively. You're having thoughts raced, you have dreams and stuff, but you're not even aware much during your sleep. But your brain is actually much more active. And so what they think is going on is that your brain has a process of cataloging memories and processing events that happen during the day that it performs at night. So while you're sleeping, it is assigning memories to its catalog, which is and making sense of what happened during the day. And so which is why often, and you've probably experienced this, you go to bed frustrated about something, you wake up the next morning and you feel like you got a good idea. And you feel like you can do it. Something happened while you were sleeping that allowed you to think about it more clearly when you wake up. So we've all heard people say that, and we've probably done it ourselves. Let me just sleep on it and see how I think about it tomorrow. Well, what they think is happening is that your brain actually is thinking about it while you're sleeping, and your brain is processing the events of the day and cataloging it in certain memory places and saying what is valuable to keep and what needs to be discharged. And that process goes on while we sleep, which is probably why you often wake up with a good solution if you've slept on it, because your brain literally in the process of sorting out the day's events for a fresh start cataloging things in different memory centers, your brain is still thinking about it. And your brain is making connections because your brain is saying, where does this memory go and where does this? So in the process of making connections, your brain is processing relationships, is what they think. Relationships between memories. So you're actually thinking about how the different parts of your day fit together so that your brain can put them in the right spot. And that's why when you wake up, you tend to have a better picture of what happened the day before. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Sometimes these things we say it, oh, let me sleep about it, without really realizing something is going on while we do that. So that's kind of an interesting thing with the sleep. Let me see here.
With your brain working overtime when you're sleeping, does that have anything to do with people who have seizures and overactive brain?
Yeah, I don't know. I know a lot of seizures that come at night, I think, are epileptic in nature, I think. So I don't know that is a cause. I mean, it could be why they're maybe more frequent or something, but I know that everybody's brain does it. So I guess it could be possible that if someone, I know a lot of times people report having very scary dreams of being they can't move.
Yeah.
And so, a spiritual thing is that sometimes that is a demonic attack. If you want to have a spiritual explanation, that sometimes that is a demonic attack. I don't know if you've ever had one. I've had a dream like that where I felt like I couldn't move. Like there was something keeping me from moving. It's a very weird feeling. If you ever have one, you'll never be mistaken about whether you had one. I mean, you know it when you have one of those. But I read some scientific journals where they tried to say that was a form of epileptic seizure while you're sleeping, and that's why you have that weird feeling of you can't move. And so, I'm not sure which way it is, but it is interesting that your brain does so much more, which is why, sometimes, I don't know if you've ever had that feeling of just 1,000 thoughts a minute just flying through. You're kind of like half asleep, and it's just, I've had that sometimes where it's just one picture after another. It just seems like it's going so fast, and you're thinking, what in the world? Because you're not fully awake, but you're just going through rapid fire, a whole bunch of different random thoughts and pictures and images. And so your brain intensity actually goes way up while you sleep. All right. One thing that they found in studying creativity is that what your brain is actually doing is pulling on long-term memory to make associations for future things. And so the long-term memory centers are very much connected with your creative centers. And so it's like your brain is trying to draw on the reservoir of past experience to try and create something interesting for the future. All right? Trying to draw on the reservoir of past experience to make something interesting for the future. Because in reality, we can't really create anything, right? Creativity is just variety of combination, how you choose to combine something. Only God can create, right? All we do is recombine things. To give you an example, if I was to ask you to create a new color, right? Simple, right? You just need a new color, right? And then all you can think of to do is come up with a different combination of the ones that we already have. You can't, in your own mind, create a new color because we are not creators. We only have the ability to combine in new patterns, right? And so creativity is really a pattern recognition process where you're drawing on long-term memory to kind of, apply things in new ways, right? Another thing, I did this when we first, several years ago, but I had you think about this. But if you were to think about, because God is eternal, right? So He's always been, and He always will be. But because we're not, we have a very hard time grasping in our mind something that has always been before. We don't have any problem thinking I will always be, right? When you talk about, God saying, okay, you're going to be with me for eternity, we have no issue thinking about things going that way, right? Because that's how we're created, right? But God says, I've always been. And we have a hard time imagining, because your brain will start to think, well, then what started it back here? And your brain is just trying to move the dot farther back because it has no reference, because we are created. And so the only reference we have is of creation. And so we have a hard time in our mind wrapping it around something that has always been. It seems that's one of the hardest parts of someone to grasp the things that God tells us about himself, is the fact that he's always been. Because immediately your mind says, well, something had to start him. And the reason our mind says that is because we are creation, right? And so it's embedded in us. So there's certain things that our mind has limitations on based on how we were created. But so anyways, the idea is only God can create, right? Everything else is creation. And so all we can do is combine in interesting ways. And that's what we call creativity. All right. Research shows that the longer we're on a job, the more our creativity naturally drops, right? So you have to be much more, it is. You have to be much more intentional to be creative the longer you've been on a job. So why would that be? Which of the three? Routine. The longer you've been on a job, the more your brain starts to associate this environment you're in with routine and not with so what it does is, when it says routine, that doesn't necessarily kill creativity. What it does is your brain sets in the patterns of thought that are associated with that environment, and that kills routine, or that kills creativity. And so the idea is, if you could put somebody in a ever-changing environment, right, or give them opportunities to be in some different things, then their creativity levels will go up. Which is why if you go to Google or some of these places, I don't know if they're doing that intentionally because they know this research. I think maybe they've just stumbled onto something that works. But the idea is they're constantly giving their people, free reign to do whatever they want in their environment. Build Lego sets, build trains, go around on a unicycle. That's how their offices are. It's totally unstructured. They've got a few administrators that handle the structure side, but the creative people, they just let them run wild and do whatever they want to do. And I think it has to do with that if you can keep them in a non-routine environment, you keep the creative levels much higher. So depending on what you're wanting your people to do, you have to understand this research that if their environment doesn't change, their creativity will weaken after time. Okay. All right. Just a couple of strategies for improving creativity, and then I want to jump into some things with brain health. So one thing is to list the attributes of a situation. So just listing the attributes, right? There's something about creating a list of what's involved in the situation that starts to trigger the creative juices. So instead of trying to figure out a creative solution to the problem, if you start by just listing the components of the problem, in that process, your brain generally starts to trigger its own creative thinking. So instead of starting with trying to be creative, start going through every possible attribute of the problem, and start trying to make a list. And in the making of the list, you start triggering your brain's own natural pattern recognition components, and then you begin to start being more creative. And then the other thing is to list alternative viewpoints, right? So no matter what you think the right thing is, put yourself in another perspective and see how you see it from there. That's a real key to being creative, is trying to not pigeonhole yourself into one perspective. Even if you know you're right, put yourself in your opponent or somebody else's shoes or a different perspective and look at it that way, and you will normally pick up something else that adds to your perspective, right? And then let me see here. Now, I know in corporate situations, just as a side note, in corporate situations, they will often, these large companies will hire they'll start their own small company and say, put us out of business, right? What would you do, right? So that's kind of a creative side thing. You can take that same principle in yourself and say, if somebody was going to put my small business under, what would they do? What could they create? You know what I'm saying? You put yourself in a different perspective, and so a lot of times corporations will do that. They'll give members of their group, they'll hire some people or something, give them some seed money, and say, go out and see if you can be the one to create something that's better than what we have, because if you do, then we own your company, and now we have the next thing that would have disrupted us, right? And then, let me see here. We talked about changing venue. I think that's good. Let's go into brain health. So we talked in different times about neuroplasticity in other classes. You've probably seen the Lumosity commercials on television, where they say it's like games, right? But it's done in a way that's, will improve your brain. And they say it's the science of neuroplasticity. That, if you remember, just simply means that your brain has the capacity to rewire itself even into old age, right? And so no matter what your age, your brain has the capacity to rewire based on current circumstances and based on what you're applying yourself to, which is why going back to school at any age, even if it's older, is a catalyst for all kinds of new things, because your brain starts to challenge itself again and starts to rewire itself. Another way that the brain rewires itself is with repetition of something. So like that's why if you start playing the piano, you're really bad at first. It's not just that you don't understand the chords. Your brain is not wired to do that well yet. And so as you practice it, it's not just that all of a sudden you've learned it better. Through repetition, your brain begins to associate this is important because we're doing it a lot, and it will rewire itself in that area. And then all of a sudden, because you have now more neural connectors, because your brain is getting the hint this is something important, and it starts rewiring itself more fully and more connected in the areas that do that skill, then all of a sudden it just starts to become natural, right? And it's not that you just learned it better and that now you know the chords in a better way. It is a physical change that actually happens in your brain as well that helps you to be more skilled. And that's not just in the piano, that's in anything that you apply yourself to. That's why practice causes you to become so much better, is your brain is actually rewiring itself.